Hello and welcome back to another Flutzes and Waxels video. It's just Alicia again, here to talk to you all about what makes turns good, bad, or mediocre. We talk a lot as a sport about good turns, bad turns, missing key points, and the skaters who really nail them. But how many of us have a truly clear idea of what that means? It's easy enough to look at someone fall out of a turn or bobble on it and say it was bad. But beyond that, there are more ways than you might expect for turns to go wrong. And especially in ice dance, this can be the difference between a victory and a middling to bottom of the rankings finish. So, if we're going to understand ice dance and the way it's scored, we need to understand what makes turns good, bad, and mediocre. This will be most helpful if you have a pretty solid understanding of how edges and turns work. You can definitely still get plenty out of this in the theoretical sense if you haven't quite got that down, but this will make a lot more sense if you already understand, at least a little, what each of these turns are. Again, figure skating and especially ice dance are complicated and full of nuances. It takes a lot more than one video to tell you the difference between good, bad, and mediocre turns. I've done my best to cover the majority of the biggest things to look for, but there are always more, and it takes time to learn to identify both turns and their problems. The most important part of turns, of course, is the edges. So that seems like a good place to start. If the edges are correct, that generally makes for at least a mediocre turn. The first thing to consider is whether you can clearly see what edge the skater is on. When it comes to turns, clear, discernible edges are king. Edges may end up correct, but the edge immediately after the turning point is just as important as the sustained edge. Frankly, it's even more important. The edges are the most key aspect of turns. They're how we distinguish between them. But there are more factors to a good or great turn beyond the minimum, which is correct edges. A really good skater can execute these turns correctly, but also with additional factors which improve the quality of the turns. The first is neat feet. Each kind of turn has a precise way for the free leg to be positioned at various points in the turn. Doing this correctly will help ensure correct weight placement throughout the turn, which we'll cover a little bit more later. And in the case of turns done in hold, this ensures skaters' lines match and reduces any sloppiness in terms of the relation between the skaters. For many turns, neat feet means that the ankles are squeezed together, not allowing the free leg to be loose in the air. But for some of the more difficult turns, the free leg may begin either in front or behind and change at the point of the turn. And of course, when we're talking about Mohawks and Choctaws, neat feet are a little bit different. It's all about how close to the instep, the heel, or the back of the foot the free leg is placed. These placements can be modified to match the mood of a skater's music, but often are not, as they increase the risk of turns being done incorrectly. The general placement stays the same, though the free leg may be bent rather than straight, in most cases when it's changed. Maintaining or even building speed through a step sequence is the hallmark of a quality skater. When you look for a step sequence that shows off a skater's quality of turns, you should be aware of their speed. However, skaters and choreographers can give the illusion of high-quality edges by sneaking in crosscuts and/or simple pushes. There's no avoiding having some simple pushes and/or crosscuts, and there's no denying the quality of a well-done crosscut, but the ability to build speed can still be shown off. The easiest place to identify this ability to build or maintain speed is when we look at turn clusters. When a team executes a one-foot step sequence, for example, do they build up a lot of speed before starting and lose speed by the end? Or do they maintain or even gain speed throughout the sequence? This is incredibly challenging, but can take an ice dancer from good to great. You can also look for these moments in the clusters in more standard step sequences. These are some of the most key features of good quality turns, but we'll cover the ways they can go wrong, which will cover a little bit more the ways that turns are done well as well. But first, we should define some things. The edge rules that I discussed earlier apply to all turns, but many of the other rules about what makes for a good turn, including neat feet, is quite different from 1 foot turns to turns with a change of foot. We'll talk about which turns fall into which category and the way you can evaluate each category. Plus, we'll also talk about some turns that don't fit neatly into either category. Turns with a change of foot include mohawks and Choctaws, and the biggest thing to look for in terms of mistakes is skidding and hopping between feet, rather than smoothly stepping from one distinct edge to another. If a skater is careless with these turns, they may hop them, where the change of foot isn't clean and there's a gap between when one foot is on the ice and when the other is. This can be a stylistic choice, but it doesn't make for a correctly executed turn. These turns also, of course, call for neat feet. Open and closed mohawks and Choctaws, which I talked about a little bit in the last video, each have their own distinct correct foot placements. We don't have time to get into that today, but they are a little bit different. When it comes to 1 foot turns, free leg placement is even more important. Rockers, counters, brackets, and 3 turns all have different free leg placements, which allow for the seamless execution of these turns. With these turns as well, hops and skids are common turn errors, but they look quite different from these same mistakes when done on turns with a change of foot. You may have noticed one key ice dance turn missing from this list, and that's because twizzles are a little different from the other 1 foot turns. This turn isn't a direct change of edge from one to another, but a continuous movement transitioning from the entrance edge to the exit edge. Because twizzles are so different, but so crucial to ice dance, they're going to get their own video, which is up next in this series. But the most important way to ensure twizzles are correct is to ensure the rotation is continuous. The tracing on the ice might look like a series of 3 turns, but sets of 3 turns are individualized turns, even without putting a foot down. But like I said, we'll cover all of this next time, or I'm going to be here all day. There is one more turn which doesn't play by the rules of other 1 foot turns. We don't see them very often in ice dance because they aren't done in hold and are not a level feature in ice dance step sequences. These are loops. Not the jumps, not the backtracking prohibited in some ice dance step sequences, but the turn. These turns, as the name implies, draw a loop on the ice, and they start and finish on the same edge. They play by their own rules because the turning point is not one defined moment, but the entirety of the loop drawn on the ice. When botched, we're not looking for the same issues we see in other turns, but instead we see an incorrect tracing, which admittedly can be quite difficult to spot. That said, because this is mostly about ice dance, and we unfortunately don't see these very often in ice dance, I'm not going to talk about them from this point forward. There are a huge number of ways in which turns can go wrong. I'm not able to cover every single one here, or we'd be here all week, but they mostly fall into a few categories. The first is edge issues. If you can't immediately tell whether they're on an inside or an outside edge, that is a point where the tech panel will often take a closer look or immediately identify that turn as incorrect, as it could be lacking in an edge, meaning it's on a flat, or it might subtly be on the incorrect edge. We see this particular cheat a lot with rockers, counters, and Choctaws. You may see the free leg swing through to change the edge, especially with less advanced skaters. Or skaters, especially at higher levels, may just shift their weight to change the edge. As we discussed earlier, correct edges are what make a turn what it is. You can't attempt a turn with the wrong edge and still have it be the correct turn. In cases where this happens, the rocker is actually a 3 turn with a change of edge, and the Choctaw is actually a mohawk with a change of edge. This has a serious impact on the level, as rockers and Choctaws and counters are difficult turns used for level features in step sequences, and 3 turns and mohawks are not. Some skaters are better at covering these mistakes up than others, but it happens to everyone, at least some of the time. These edge changes can be incredibly difficult to spot, but this is one of the many things that tech specialists are trained to look for. That of course doesn't mean you can't learn to look for them, but it's not going to be easy. So it's inevitable that you'll miss some or even most of these mistakes, especially as you learn to first identify errors in turns. The second, and the easiest one to often identify, is misplaced weight, because there is usually a very clear visual clue when this happens. Usually, one of 2 things will happen when a skater's weight isn't in the correct place on a turn. Either they will have to stabilize themselves with the upper body, which usually happens when the weight is too far back, or snow will fly up as the skater's blade skids on the ice or the toe picks scratch through the turn, which is generally what happens when the skater's weight is too far forward. But either of these two things can happen when the weight is not in the correct place. Weight placement is a precise and specific thing, so these mistakes vary quite a lot. If the weight is just slightly off, you'll see a little snow fly up, but otherwise it'll probably look correct. If the weight is way off, you're more likely to see stumbles, bobbles, and serious weight checks. In cases where skaters try to find the correct weight placement in turns like twizzles, we may see rocking, which means it's not really a correct twizzle anymore. But again, we'll get more in depth into this next time. And finally, hopped turns. Now, these aren't big jumps. If you're not looking for them, you might not even notice. But through a combination of factors, like too much speed for their level of control, bad edges, or misplaced weight, skaters may lose the edge entirely at the apex of the turn and come all the way or most of the way off the ice. These can be incredibly subtle, but over time you can learn to identify how much knee bend a skater should have, or by focusing entirely on their feet, you can start to spot turns that have been hopped. Some turns call either for a deepening of the knee bend or extending the skating knee, but in either case, if you're looking closely, you can spot a skater popping up a little more than they should. All of these mistakes happen for all skaters occasionally. But like other errors, the more common they are for any given skater or team, the more concerning they are. Of course, we can't expect ice dancers, or any skaters for that matter, to be perfect, but that doesn't mean we can't acknowledge when they make mistakes. And this is a skill that will help you to understand better the reasons why a team you love may not have finished as high as a team you don't care for as much. This is a lot of information, and a lot of it is very general. And that's because turn problems happen all the time. They're easy to miss, and there are 1,000,001 ways they can go wrong. But this is a great time to go back to an event or program where you were confused by the levels or the final results and start looking for these small errors. I guarantee you will find them, if you're looking closely enough, that is. You may very well not be able to find them all today, but in the long run, with work, you can definitely learn to catch more and more of them. You may never be a tech specialist, but you don't need to be to understand better why results in ice dance happen the way they do. Now, we will be back with a specific video on twizzles because they are such a hallmark in ice dance. They're in every step sequence and the synchronized twizzles, so we will cover that, which will cover even more ways that turns, and specifically twizzles, can go wrong. So keep your eyes peeled for that coming in the next several weeks, but until then, I hope you'll all be listening to our podcast, Flutzes and Waxels, a figure skating podcast, wherever you find podcasts.